Well, the traditional view is that Onesimus was a runaway slave. As slaves were wont to do from time immemorial, Onesimus may have fled from his master, Philemon. Somehow, voluntarily or accidentally, he fell in with the Apostle Paul, who was able to win him to the faith. Scholars in this century have challenged this traditional scenario, and they call attention to the absence of any explicit mention in the letter that Onesimus had run away or of the need for his master to forgive his slave's flight. They also note that it would have been an astounding coincidence for a fugitive slave to meet Paul, the one person who knew his master during his imprisonment. For a slave to run away was a grave crime that the authorities in this era treated seriously. As a Roman citizen, Paul could have been given more freedom in his confinement. A captured runaway slave, however, would have been clapped in irons and kept under guard in a slave prison and not allowed free contact with Paul. How then could he have been of service to Paul, according to verse 13? If Onesimus were not a prisoner and had a freedom of movement, he could have done much for Paul. But how and why would he have had contact with the imprisoned Paul? We can only conjecture. Perhaps something other than happenstance brought Onesimus to Paul. But it may be that Onesimus was not a fugitive slave. It may be that he came to Paul in prison because his owner sent him there on behalf of the church in Colossae. But if Onesimus were not a Christian before he met Paul and was regarded as useless, according to verse 11, why would Philemon or the church entrust him with such a responsibility? Why let an undependable slave run loose across the countryside? Why charge a non-Christian with such an important spiritual mission? Was he the only one Philemon could spare? True, the owner might have sent Paul a worthless slave as a cost-effective but miserly way to help Paul. Or more positively, he was sent in the hope that contact with Paul might help straighten him out. But both options seem most improbable. What rules against this view is Paul's discreet mention of his willingness to reimburse the owner for any wrong that Onesimus may have done in verses 18 through 19. And his diplomatic description of Onesimus' separation from his master in verse 15, where he says, he was separated from you for a little while. If the church had sent Onesimus, Paul could not have described him in the same glowing terms as he used for the Philippians Epaphroditus, whom he says, you sent to take care of my needs. It sounds as if Paul is gingerly searching in verses 15 through 16 for some euphemism to describe a getaway rather than a commissioning. He only mentions it to hint that there may have been some divine reason behind Onesimus' departure, that you might have him back for good, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. If Paul could find such a reason, it would help to absolve his guilt in keeping Onesimus so long. But Paul's hesitation in expressing his wish in verse 13, I would like to have kept him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel, is also inexplicable if the church had sent Onesimus to serve him. If Paul wants to keep him longer, why does he need to send Onesimus back on a perilous journey home to obtain permission to keep his services, only to have him turn around and head back if Philemon grants him permission to return? Why not send Tychicus with a letter to make the request and keep his services a while longer while he waits for the reply? If Onesimus had been commissioned and sent to Paul by the church,